All right, so today we're unpacking the absolutely astonishing story of Albert Einstein's most creative years. And here's a little spoiler for you. They didn't happen in some fancy university lab. Nope, they happened behind the desk of a third-class civil servant. Okay, let's get into it.
So we all recognize the icon on the left, right? The hair, the equation, the very symbol of genius. But the reality on the right, that's where our story really begins. At 23 years old, the man who would literally redefine the universe was a total unknown, struggling just to make ends meet. So how on earth did this rejected graduate become the most famous scientist in history? That's the real question.
Well, to really get why he was so successful, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand his rebellious streak, because from his earliest days, Einstein was just hardwired to question, well, everything.
As a student, Einstein was, let's just say, a handful for his professors. He absolutely hated rote memorization and rigid rules. He'd just skip lectures he thought were boring so he could stay home and read the latest physics papers all by himself. And this independent streak, his professors saw it as pure arrogance. One of them even called him a lazy dog, and he ended up graduating near the very bottom of his class.
And man, this quote just nails his whole philosophy. For Einstein, thinking for yourself wasn't just a good idea for studying, it was like a moral duty. This deep-seated skepticism he had, this refusal to just blindly accept authority, that would become the engine for his greatest discoveries.
So after graduating with so-so grades and a reputation for being difficult, Einstein steps out into the world ready to start his big academic career. Instead, the world basically slammed the door right in his face.
For nearly 2 years, he was completely frozen out of the physics community. We're talking letters to every university he could think of, begging for even a junior assistant job. And the response? Mostly crickets. He was scraping by, taking whatever odd teaching and tutoring jobs he could find, living in near poverty. He even admitted later he almost gave up on the whole dream. You can just see here how bleak it was. For 2 straight years, it was nothing but rejection. It wasn't until 1902, and only because of a favor from a friend's dad, that he finally landed a stable job. Not as a professor, not as a researcher, but as a patent examiner in Bern, Switzerland. To him, it must have felt like a total dead end.
But here's the crazy part. What looked like the ultimate failure was actually the single best thing that could have possibly happened to him. That boring patent office job, it turned out to be the perfect incubator for his genius.
So since he was totally cut off from academia, what does he do? He builds his own little university. He and a couple of friends started what they call the Olympia Academy, which was really just a fancy name for a tiny club where they'd get together and passionately debate the biggest ideas in science and philosophy. It was right there, totally outside the classroom, that his mind really caught fire. So how did this job actually help him? Well, it gave him everything he needed. First off, a steady paycheck, which was a huge deal. Second, his boss literally trained him to be skeptical of everything, to assume every claim was wrong until proven otherwise. But the biggest thing of all was the mental freedom. He had no academic pressure, no professors to please. He was free to ask the big, almost childlike questions nobody else was asking. And since he was brilliant, he'd finish his day's work in just a few hours, leaving the rest of the day completely free to just sit there and quietly unravel the secrets of the cosmos.
And all of this quiet thinking, this incredible intellectual freedom, it was all building up to one single, explosive year that would completely change our view of reality. Forever.
The year was 1905. It's known today as his Annus Mirabilis, his miracle year. While still working his full-time gig as a patent clerk, a 26-year-old Einstein published 4 papers that just turned the entire world of physics completely upside down.
I mean, the sheer scale of what he did here is just staggering. Think about it. At the time, everyone knew light was a wave. He comes along and says, well, it's also a particle. And boom, quantum theory is born. People were still debating if atoms were real. He provided the first real proof they existed. Everyone just knew space and time were fixed. He showed they were relative. And then, almost as an afterthought, he gives us the most famous equation in history, E equals mc squared. You know, any one of these papers would have been a career-making, Nobel-worthy breakthrough. He published all 4 in his spare time.
And let this sink in for a second. He did all of it with no university, no lab, and no colleagues in his field to bounce ideas off of. It was just him, his brain, and a desk drawer at the patent office where he hid his calculations.
Eventually, of course, the world of physics did catch up and fame came calling. But the real lesson, The true story here is in all those years he spent as a complete unknown.
And here is the most fascinating twist. When Einstein finally won the Nobel Prize, it wasn't even for his most famous theory, relativity. That was still seen as way too weird and controversial. No, the prize was for his work on the photoelectric effect, a theory he came up with all the way back in 1905, when he was just a humble patent clerk trying to make sense of the universe.
Which brings us all back to the big question. What's the takeaway here? Because Einstein's story is just so powerful for anyone who's ever felt stuck or overlooked, or maybe like they're on the completely wrong path.
His journey is just incredible proof that where you are right now doesn't define where you're going. Passion, real curiosity, it doesn't need a fancy title or a corner office to flourish. In fact, sometimes the greatest work, the real breakthroughs, happen when you're totally free from all the expectations and the pressures of the establishment. That intellectual freedom, that's the real prize.
And this quote just says it all perfectly. Those years in the wilderness, they weren't some kind of setback. They weren't a detour from his destiny. They were the very thing that made his revolutionary genius possible. They are the reason he became Einstein.